Yo, it's Joe with Always Blue 7 Gaming, back with another tabletop tier ranking. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite games, if not my favorite game. It's up there kind of always swapping back and forth with Blood Rage. But today's Root from Leader Games. Cole Worley and Patrick Leader are the designers on it. Kyle Farron is the artist. Today we're going to talk about all of the different factions, and we're going to rank them in the absolute perfect tier ranking out there. And certainly there's going to be no controversy with that. But we're going to kind of start with the base game Root, and we're going to go into the expansions, even the Marauder expansion that is coming up here in the near future, being delivered from Kickstarter. So let's start it off with the Marquis de Cat. The Marquis de Cat is the #1 most iconic faction when it comes to Root. They are the current rulers of the forest, the new rulers, and they are just spreading out their catness across the woodlands. They are really based around an economy of building buildings, as well as collecting wood to build more and more buildings. The more buildings you have out there, the more points you're going to get. They are, as I said earlier, the iconic meeple, the iconic warrior of Root, and they're kind of the poster boy faction for Root. The Cats are really a good faction when it comes to facing any other factions, and they always have a chance at winning the game, even no matter what factions you're playing against. And they also, some people say they play better on certain maps versus other maps. In particular, the winter map. A lot of people like to corner themselves off in the kind of top row up there in the winter map. But all around, the Marquis de Cat are just excellent factions. So with that, we're going to start off by giving the Cats an A tier ranking. Next up is the old rulers of the forest, the rulers that the Cats displaced, and that is the Eerie Dynasty. They are kind of a programming faction where you are going to put 1 or 2 cards into the decree each round, and you're going to have to take every single action that you put into your decree in the clearings that match the suits of the card that you put in your decree. So if you have a mouse clearing in your recruit, you must recruit in a mouse clearing. If you can't do that, then you're going to go into turmoil, and you are going to have to put a new leader into play. The different leaders are really interesting based on the cards you start out with in your opening hand. It can depend on who your leader should be, and it can be very interesting to play off strategies based on who you start with your first leader as, and if you want to try and turmoil intentionally based on, maybe you're throwing everything into recruit, you want to get all your warriors on the board you can, as an example. They're very bad at crafting, as they only get 1 point no matter what the point value is for the crafting. It's really interesting that they win ties in the different clearings as well, so you always have to take that into consideration when you're doing different actions to make sure you can continue to move. It makes it a little bit easier to ensure that your decree gets fulfilled each turn. But again, the Eyrie are kind of just a really solid faction that is always competitive. They really start out kind of slow. You're getting very few points compared to a lot of different factions. But as you build up your decree, as you build up your engine, you're going to start getting a lot of points per turn. And if you can avoid turmoil late in the game, you have a really good chance at winning. And for that, I'm going to put the Eyrie as also an A faction. Next up is the Woodland Alliance. The Woodland Alliance is kind of a love-hate faction. You love to play them, but you really hate to play against them. They're kind of the underground rebellion, and their biggest thing is kind of hand management. You are kind of going around trying to spread your sympathy throughout the forest, and you really have a small presence on the board to start the game off as you're just trying to spread your sympathy. You typically get a lot of hate in the beginning. People are attacking your sympathy, and you really can't defend it because there's always the threat of the revolt out there. And if you haven't revolted in a specific suit yet, all of the clearings that you have sympathy in of that suit are at risk, and that makes all the other factions a little nervous. So they are often going to attack you, and you really have to try and build up your supporters so that you can have big turns, you can spread a lot of sympathy, and you can ultimately revolt and get some of your buildings out on the board, get some of your warriors out on the board, and ultimately score a lot of points that way. Like I said, you do start off with a small board presence, but again, kind of like the Eerie, you can build up your presence. You can really go after a lot of players at the end of the game because you also are very defensive. You take the higher roll die when you are being attacked, so that gives you a lot of an advantage once you get your warriors on the board, and you really can score huge points in your last turns that can really give you some pretty awesome come from behind victories. I'm really back and forth with the Woodland Alliance on whether they're an S or an A tier. It's pretty tough. I think that I'm going to give them an A tier ranking because they do have the problem that they can get cornered. If people do put enough warriors surrounding you, they can corner you. You can't spread your sympathy that easily. You have to spend a lot more cards, and in that case, that really puts them in the A versus the S. Now, last but not least, probably the most polarizing and hated faction in the entire game and in the base box is the Vagabond. The Vagabond is kind of the very interesting faction because you only have one warrior out on the board. Every other faction has tons of warriors, a lot of meeple, a lot of board presence, but the Vagabond, you only have one single warrior out on the board, and you're kind of the RPG character, the adventurer, and you can kind of play both sides. You can play the ally and you can play the enemy, depending upon how you want to play the game with the different factions. It makes it very interesting, and there's a lot of different types of Vagabonds that you can play. You know, you do have the Harrier, the Tinkerer, that a lot of people think are overpowered and they want to get nerfed, but the Vagabond is very fun in that sense, and there's a lot of variety there when you're playing the Vagabond. Now, you're really going to get a lot of hate with players who have played Root a lot before. They're going to want to punch you, they're going to want to hit you early, damage your items, make it much more difficult for you to play the game. But if you get left alone and you're playing the nice guy, you can really, kind of like the Woodland Alliance, score a ton of points at the end of the game when you are attacking other factions or you're questing late in the game. So you can kind of fall under the radar sometimes. It's very unique for this game. You know, like I said, you have a single pawn versus all these big armies, and you really can compete. A lot of people really hate the Vagabond. They don't like it in their games, but I think it adds an interesting twist. And because of the way the Vagabond can really score a lot of points at the end of the game, and some of their Vagabonds, again, Tinkerer, Harrier, are very, very powerful Vagabonds, the Vagabond is going to get an S tier ranking. It's pretty easy. I mean, I know you hate to see it, but you know, you can't deny how good the Vagabond can be, and it's tough. You know, the Vagabond, you can play that role where you're convincing people to not police you, to leave you alone. Oh, I'm the poor little Vagabond in the background. And if people don't take care of you, then you're going to be able to really sneak in there and often win the game. So S tier easily. Now we're going to get into the first expansion for Root, and that is the Riverfolk expansion. This includes the lake map, which is a very fun, interesting map, but it also includes two factions. The first of those factions being the Lizard Cult. The Lizard Cult is kind of this crazy cult fanatic group that's trying to convert all the warriors from the other factions as acolytes to their cause. So they can go out and build their gardens and worship those gardens, protect the gardens, and ultimately score points for those gardens. They have a very interesting mechanism with their discard pile, which is called the Lost Souls, where all of the cards from all the other players get discarded too. And this determines the outcast suit and or the hated outcast suit, in which that's where the Lizard Cult is going to be able to perform all their actions. So the Lizard Cult is a very defensive faction. You want to protect your gardens because one of your actions is to actually score your gardens. So if the particular outcast suit is foxes and you have a bunch of gardens in your fox suits and you're going to take that action to score, you know, you're going to be able to score all the gardens in the fox suit. So you're going to want to protect those gardens to be able to get all your points. Now, it can be very difficult to play the Lizard Cult. They're one of the harder factions to play well because that outcast and hated outcast suit is so critical to the game. If you're not getting cards that allow you to play with the outcast suits, hated outcast suits, you're going to be pretty stuck. You're going to have a rough time trying to score points and keep up with the other factions. And for that, I have to give the Lizard Cult a C tier ranking. You can really get screwed. It sometimes feels really bad to play the Lizard Cult. I think they're a really interesting faction. There's a lot of potential, and I really admire the people that can play the Lizard Cult well. But I just have a tough time playing them, and for that, I just can't keep them on the same level as the other factions that we've talked about so far. So C tier. The other faction in the Riverfolk expansion is the Riverfolk Company, or also known as the Otters. A lot of people just call them the Otters. The Riverfolk Company is easy to mispronounce and pretty lengthy, so Otters it is. And they are the merchants of the Woodlands. Everyone comes to the Otters to get their wares, to buy different things and services to help them in the game. And they have a very interesting mechanic that is an open hand. They are kind of the faction that gets to interact with every other faction on the board in a very friendly way as they try and sell their services. Their services are cards in their hand, riverboats, and mercenaries. And that's why you have that open hand. You want other players to see your cards. And every turn, the Otters are going to set a price for those three services. And ultimately, other factions are going to be able to spend their warriors to pay for those services. So Riverfolk Company has extra cards. You're gonna be able to purchase those, and when the Riverfolk Company gets warriors, they're gonna be able to use those warriors to spend funds and commit warriors to do different things on the board. And that could be send their warriors around, move their warriors around, fight people. It could be to put out their trading posts. And when it comes to the Riverfolk, you can do a lot of different strategies. But a lot of people really like the death ball strategy, where you get a lot of Otters in one particular clearing and you go around just fighting all the factions with this big group of Otters. It's pretty fun, but there's a lot of negotiation for your services, and you have to do a lot of convincing as the Otters to get the other factions to want to buy your services. You're going to want to interact with them and tell them, hey, this is why you should buy mercenaries. This is why you should buy riverboats. This is why you should buy these cards from my hand. And it can sometimes be tough if you're not playing with the right people to be the Otters, right? If people aren't buying your services, if you have good stuff and they don't want to give you any resources, you can really be left behind, and that makes it tough because the Otters are such an interesting and fun faction to play. Now the Otters, their strategy is very interesting because you already have 15 points that you can very easily score. And that's if you get all of your trade posts out, right? So at the end of the day, you're just trying to find 15 more points to get you there, but you got to find those 15 more points faster than everybody else. And that can be tough again if you're not getting people to purchase your services. So for that reason, I have to put the Otters at a B tier. Now that is the Riverfolk expansion. The next expansion we're going to talk about is the Underworld expansion. The Underworld expansion brought us the mountain map, which is a very cool map, where you can open up mountain passes, and you also have the King of the Hill clearing there as well. But you also have two more factions. The first one we're going to talk about is the Underground Duchy. Also, this is a faction that's known as the Moles, and this is my favorite faction. Right now, the Underground Duchy is kind of this other society that's living underground. It has their own rules and laws and ways that they govern themselves, and they're coming up into the forest to try and compete in the woodlands as well. Their mechanic is kind of action management. You are showing your cards to do different actions, whether that's to move or build, or they have a very cool dig action where you can put a tunnel in a different clearing and you can kind of do this cool flanking mechanism on people that might be on the other side of the board away from your main buildings and your main forces, which is really fun. It's kind of interesting with the bird cards, as the bird cards are obviously wild, but if you reveal bird cards as the Moles, you lose those. So you got to be very careful when you are revealing your bird cards. And you're building more buildings with the Moles to get more warriors, to get more card draw, to kind of build up that engine. But the really interesting part is swaying your ministers. When you sway ministers, you're going to sway ministers for extra points and also for powerful actions. And there's kind of three tiers of ministers. There's squires, which are the lowest. There's nobles, which are the medium. And then there's lords, which are the highest. And each of those costs more cards to be revealed to recruit or sway those ministers. When you sway the higher level ministers, you're going to get much more powerful actions. So it's kind of interesting to try and decide, all right, am I going to go for a low level one because it's cheaper and get that action, or do I want to save up and get a higher level minister so I can get a really powerful action? That's a very fun mechanism. That's why they're my favorite faction so far. And obviously, they're just really awesome, cute meeples as well. So it's very interesting to strategize on building versus swaying and optimizing all of that. You have some interesting strats like the Bridget the Brigadier strat, and like I said, the flanking strat. But the moles are very powerful. You can really get a nice presence up there on the board. You can really get a good engine going, and for that, I'm going to give them an A tier status. The other faction in the Underworld expansion is the Corvid conspiracy. The Corvids are a really interesting faction that I think really has a lot of potential and doesn't get as much credit as they should from the Root community. But they are kind of the, for lack of a better term, a terrorist kind of faction. The Corvid are often trying to put out their different plot tokens, and their plot tokens are bombs, snares, extortion, or raids. And that's kind of why they kind of remind me of a terrorist faction. But their main mechanism is kind of bluffing and deception. When you put out your plot tokens as the Corvids, you're putting them face down into different clearings. And you're really trying to put those down so that you can activate them and flip them without the other factions being able to guess that. So you're trying not to be predictable in what you're putting down, because if the other factions guess that, they're going to be able to get rid of those plot tokens, and that's really going to put you behind. Similar to a number of other factions, they have a very small presence on the board to start out with, but can really build up. And I think that they really have a lot of potential if people would just give them a little bit more time and be able to think through what plots they're putting down and where. You really have to do a lot with a little when you're the Corvids. And with the idea that you might not be able to deceive some people from what plot tokens you're putting down, or you might be backed into a corner where you have to use a certain plot token and people just keep guessing them, I'm going to give the Corvids a C tier ranking as well. They may be the hardest faction to win the game with, and that can certainly be frustrating sometimes, but I'm really looking forward to playing them more. And I think that they could definitely rise up the rankings here in the tier ranking, but for right now, they're a C tier. The last couple of factions we're going to talk about here are the factions from the expansion that's coming out here soon, the Marauders expansion. The first faction we're going to talk about is the Lord of the Hundreds, and I think that the Lord of the Hundreds faction is the one that could compete with the Moles for being my favorite faction. They are a very destructive faction. They want to go around and oppress the woodlands. They want to destroy all the pieces in your clearing. And they want to do this with battling and inciting mobs. Now, it's very unique with the Lord of the Hundreds that they have a lot of meeple warriors, but they also have the Warlord, which is the same kind of meeple, but it's carrying a flag. This is kind of their special warrior. It can't really be removed from the board. It can do extra things. And being able to use that Warlord effectively is a very interesting mechanism as well. The Lord of the Hundreds faction also has an emphasis on getting items into their horde. So they're the other faction outside of the Vagabond that has an interest in items. And when the Lord of the Hundreds gets items, they're going to increase their command. That gives them more action. They're going to be able to increase their prowess, which gives them more recruiting and allows them to move their Warlord more often. Because they have such an interest in items, they also have this Looter's ability, which allows them to take items from other factions, which is also very interesting. The other part that makes the Lord of the Hundreds so interesting is the mood. So as the Lord of the Hundreds, you get to set your mood, and that can be stubborn, rowdy, jubilant, bitter, whatever it might be, and that's going to impact how you're playing on the board. So it's very fun to be able to figure out what mood you should be in and then switch it out your next turn for a different mood and keep your engine moving. And that's very fun and very strategic in playing the Lord of the Hundreds. You know, there's a lot of games that have been played with the Lord of the Hundreds that are up on YouTube or Twitch, and you can see it in some of the tournaments. I've only played it a couple of times, but I really think that the Lord of the Hundreds is an awesome faction and is only going to get better as the expansion gets released. So for that, I'm giving them an A tier ranking. And last but certainly not least, the last faction in the Marauders expansion, and the last faction we're going to talk about here, that's the Keepers in Iron. The Keepers in Iron are the Badgers, which is very interesting. And they are kind of this faction that's been around, and they're about history and recovering old relics that were lost in previous wars in the woodlands. And they're all about getting these relics. They are trying to collect the relics from where they are at the start of the game, which they're in all the forest clearings. And in order to do that, they need to rule multiple clearings next to these different relics. And they're going to get these relics by pulling them into their particular clearing using the delve action. They're going to delve in, they're going to get the relic out, and then they're ultimately going to take those back to the way stations they've built in different clearings to ultimately recover those relics and score points. Now they're trying to recover all the relics with the highest point values. The relics that are all the same type have different number values, and you want the high ones, and you want different values or different relics with high values. So when you complete a column, you collect 3 different types of relics, you're going to score more points that way. So that's what you're trying to do. The Keepers in Iron are also a very defensive faction, similar to the Lizard Cult, where if they are protecting a relic, they actually score 1 less hit point, which is very interesting. And they also have a bit of programming, kind of like the Eerie Dynasty, where they are going to have their retinue, and that's going to determine when they move, when they battle or delve for those relics, and if they are able to move again, or if they're going to do any recovering of relics. So programming that out is pretty interesting, and I'm really excited to play the Keepers in Iron more. I haven't played too much of them, and I haven't seen too much of them, but again, I think they have a lot of potential. It's just about making sure that you rule the clearings near the relics that you need, and that can be tough sometimes. So for that, I'm not going to be able to give them an A ranking, but I think they're quite powerful and quite interesting, so they're going to get a B tier ranking from me. And there you have it. We've done it. Another tabletop tier ranking and the definitive root faction ranking as well. So if you disagree with me, please tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. If you want to talk about this more, I'd be happy to talk about it. Hit me up on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I'd love to hear your opinion about the different rankings here, or where you might rank the different factions. I'd also love to play Root more if you are interested in trying to play some games. I'm out there on the Woodland Warriors Discord. Definitely hit me up, and I appreciate you tuning in. Until next time on Tabletop Tier Ranking, this is Joe with Always Blue 7 Gaming. Take care.